What happened to the MG42 gunners, who cut down thousands of Allied soldiers, only to eventually raise their hands and surrender? The answer is simple. They just walked out of the bunkers. They dropped the heavy metal ammunition belts onto the sand. The weight left deep marks on their hands. Firing at the landing craft was never an ideological mission. It was just a job. A very exhausting one. This daily reality began long before the Normandy invasion. The MG42 first appeared in 1942. The weapon weighed 11 kilograms. It physically accompanied the German infantry across all combat fronts. Crews dragged the guns and the heavy steel mounts. They carried them from the extreme heat of North Africa to the freezing mud of the Eastern Front. It was everywhere. Soldiers set it up in city ruins, open fields, and coastal forts. By 1944, this exact machine gun stood in almost every defensive position. 15 concrete strongpoints controlled the entire beach. These gunners did not need to aim randomly because they sat in the center of a carefully calculated network. A standard crew operating the weapon consisted of 3 men working together in a tight space. One soldier pulled the trigger, keeping his eyes locked on the approaching shoreline. The second man detached the red-hot barrel, dropping it with a sharp hissing sound onto the concrete floor before slamming a fresh tube into place. Meanwhile, the third man dragged heavy metal ammunition boxes forward, feeding new belts into the weapon to keep the firing continuous. Many of these crews included teenage replacements drafted in 1944, mixed with older veterans holding combat experience from earlier campaigns. German commanders built these positions, officially known as resistance nests, to catch everything in a sweeping crossfire. Omaha Beach stretched for roughly 8 kilometers along the Normandy coast. With 15 strongpoints spread across that specific sector, the defenders had one heavily armed position sitting roughly every 500 meters. If a soldier managed to run out of one gun's line of sight, he stepped directly into the path of another. The defensive layout left almost no blind spots along the wide tidal flats. No choices remained. The men inside those bunkers either kept feeding ammunition belts into the receiver or died right there behind the gun. Allied planners mapped this exact coastline months in advance, using aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by high-altitude Spitfire planes. The invasion plan looked very straightforward on paper, featuring exact coordinates assigned for destruction by heavy naval artillery and bomber squadrons. In reality, the massive bombardment completely missed its marks, leaving those concrete bunkers mostly untouched when the landing craft finally dropped their ramps. The men who operated those machine guns simply waited behind their defensive slits. Miles away, across the water, Allied intelligence officers marked the final bunker coordinates on their paper maps. Why aim for the legs instead of the chest? A wounded soldier attracted medics, instantly multiplying the targets on the wet sand. Inside those mapped bunkers, crews relied on routine, highly effective methods. They called it mowing the grass. Gunners swept their fire low to knock men down. Men rushed to help. The gunner simply swept the beach again. A standard 50-round machine gun belt vanished in just a few seconds during these calculated bursts. Then came the visual tricks. 2 guns worked together to deceive the incoming troops. One gun fired only tracer rounds, aiming up. Soldiers assumed the aim was off and stood up. The second gun stayed hidden. It fired standard rounds low at waist height. The tracer bullets flew high above the actual kill zone. How did standard concrete survive the direct impact of thousands of naval shells? The sheer thickness of those defensive walls simply absorbed the incoming strikes. This reality left the German gunners completely unharmed inside their positions. These calculated machine gun tactics on the ground only worked because the large-scale Allied fire support plan sank right alongside their armored vehicles. A dull roar echoed across the coastline as battleships pounded the rocky bluffs. Yet the reinforced concrete bunkers showed almost no visible damage from the barrage. The secondary backup strategy relied on specialized duplex drive tanks. Putting them into the turbulent water quickly turned into a logistical disaster. Crews launched 32 of these modified vehicles straight into the ocean. They hoped their canvas screens would hold back the crashing coastal waves. Instead, the freezing seawater easily flooded those fragile protective barriers within minutes. The heavy machines rapidly went to the bottom of the channel, one after another. Losing 27 sunken tanks out of 32 meant losing 84% of the armor support before the infantry even touched the sand. This structural failure in macro planning left the incoming soldiers exposed to defensive fire. Hundreds of landing craft drifted steadily closer to the hostile shore. The infantry had to face the unbroken defensive lines without their promised mobile cover. Only 5 armored vehicles somehow managed to crawl up onto the actual beach sand. By the time the ramp doors finally dropped, the entire beach sector contained exactly 3 combat-capable tanks. Surviving German gunners met the first assault waves with heavy fire. How did the infantry survive on open sand? Soldiers simply dropped. They took cover behind steel anti-tank hedgehogs. They huddled behind the bodies of dead men. On the exposed beach, survival options ran out fast. Bullets hit the ground. The impacts kicked up wet sand directly into the faces of pinned troops. They waited. A standard MG42 belt held 50 rounds. The gunners had to swap belts frequently. American soldiers memorized that rhythm. They used the pauses. Officers screamed at their men to get up and sprint forward during those few open seconds. Survival no longer depended on textbook invasion plans. It relied entirely on pure personal initiative. One sergeant saw an opening. He gathered a small team from the chaos. They grabbed a bazooka. They crawled toward strongpoint WN61. This concrete complex poured non-stop fire across the landing zone. First, they targeted a 50mm anti-tank gun supporting the machine gunners. A direct bazooka blast destroyed the weapon. The infantrymen then pushed closer to the walls. They worked their way through the trenches. They silenced the MG42 positions, one by one with grenades. In the close quarters fighting, the squad killed 7 German defenders. 2 positions fell. The assault finally opened a narrow path inland. The sergeant's group secured the sector and paid a specific price. During the entire bunker assault, the team counted exactly 1 killed and 1 wounded. Medic Ray Lambert watched. Bullets sliced the surf around struggling men. 90% of Company A vanished at Dog Green Sector, gone in minutes. The psychological shock hit instantly. Panic paralyzed the Green troops. They froze waist-deep in the surf. Legs simply refused. The infantry heard the weapon first. Long before the steel ramps dropped, that MG42 rattle pierced the waves. It sounded exactly like tearing canvas. 1,200 rounds per minute. No weapon matched this fire rate. The gun weighed nearly 12 kilograms. Belt-fed ammunition never ran out. The heavy ramps slammed down. New recruits jumped into the ocean. The water was 12 degrees Celsius. Incoming fire immobilized them. Veterans recognized that noise instantly. The tearing sound triggered pure fear. Men dropped into the freezing water. They stayed there, paralyzed. Squad leaders screamed orders, move or die. The shoreline offered zero cover. Omaha Beach stretched for 8 kilometers. Bullets hit the struggling troops. Some units barely made it ashore. The incoming tide turned red. Fear pinned the wet survivors down. The mental trauma was permanent. The noise continued. Yet despite the mechanical sound of ripping canvas and the slaughter in the water, the surviving soldiers finally stood up and walked forward. How long can one person keep shooting? Heinrich Severloh pulled the trigger for 9 straight hours. Over at strongpoint WN62, this 20-year-old soldier watched the exact same beach from a concrete embrasure. The morning started with a sudden alarm ringing through the pitch-black darkness. He took his position by the weapon, waiting for the sun to come up over the horizon. When dawn finally broke, it revealed an ocean covered by thousands of incoming ships. Omaha Beach spanned roughly 8 kilometers, yet Severloh could only see his narrow sector of fire. As the first boats dropped their ramps, he simply started pulling the trigger. People often picture a fully staffed bunker with a large team, but the reality was quite different. Soon, his assistant gunner disappeared, leaving one 20-year-old guy to operate the weapon completely alone. He fed belt after belt into the chamber, while the barrel radiated intense heat after thousands of shots. For 9 solid hours, physical exhaustion built up alongside the mechanical routine of swapping belts and scanning the surf. He ultimately fired 12,000 rounds into the incoming waves of American infantry. No matter how many men fell, more soldiers kept stepping onto the sand in front of him. By the early afternoon, the German position began to collapse completely around him. With his ammunition finally gone, he grabbed a standard rifle and ran away from the defenses. He scrambled through deep shell craters and broken hedges, trying to survive until darkness fell. The following morning brought an abrupt end to his brief escape attempt. Surrounded by American troops, he surrendered quietly and kept a low profile. He smartly hid his actual role, making sure not to reveal he was the machine gunner from the bunker. Severlo kept his mouth shut for a reason. What happened inside a captured bunker? Infantry burned the survivors with flamethrowers. The approach took hours. Clearing took seconds. Troops hugged the concrete blind spots. They shoved heavy satchel charges through the narrow concrete slits. These canvas bags packed 9 kilograms of explosives. Eardrums ruptured. The explosions cracked the thick walls. Smoke filled the tight space. Fire came next. Men carried portable flamethrowers on their backs. They sprayed burning fuel directly inside the nest. Flames bounced off the tight walls. Temperatures hit 1,000 degrees Celsius. The smell of burnt fuel soaked into the concrete boxes. Sharp cordite filled the air. Some German gunners survived the initial blast. Ammunition ran out. They raised their hands on June 6th. But the rules of war vanished. American soldiers lost too many friends on the sand. Adrenaline pumped through their veins. They felt zero mercy. They did not take prisoners. They shot the surrendering crews right on the spot. Dead gunners littered the bunker floors. By early afternoon, the high cliffs finally fell. Infantry bypassed the destroyed machine gun nests. Combat engineers blew up the remaining steel doors. Omaha Beach featured 15 heavily fortified strongpoints. All fell. The beach exits finally opened wide. Sherman tanks pushed off the sand. The German line lost its main firepower. The surviving defenders retreated backward. They hid in the dense Normandy hedgerows. The coastal combat ended. The invasion moved inland. Who actually sat behind the heavy machine guns inside those concrete walls? Troops capturing the bunkers looked their enemies in the face, finding men they never expected to see. Many turned out to be ordinary conscripts pulled from Eastern Europe. A large part of the Wehrmacht's 709th Infantry Division consisted of Ost battalions. These units were filled with former Soviet and Polish prisoners of war who had no real stake in the fight. Allied soldiers expected to fight fanatical Nazi veterans defending the Atlantic Wall. Instead, they faced desperate foreign draftees who feared their own commanding officers much more than they cared about the regime. During the Normandy campaign, surviving the initial D-Day beach battles did not always guarantee a safe surrender. Some machine gunners tried to put their hands up once their defensive positions were completely overrun. Attacking infantrymen often dealt with these weapons crews right on the spot. Captors handed out immediate payback for the heavy casualties they just took on the sand. These field executions became a quiet reality of the early invasion. Official military archives contain zero documents about these summary executions taking place. Allied soldiers close the gap. They crawl within mere meters. Machine gun fire suppresses them. Every step forward brings death. They wait for a pause. A barrel change takes seconds. Attackers rush during this window. One grenade changes everything entirely. The heavy concrete becomes a trap. Those thick walls protected them. Now they block every exit. Conscripts stay boxed inside completely. The fight moves indoors quickly. It takes only mere seconds. Deafening echoes shatter the ears. It is an acoustic hell. Smoke clears. Concrete dust smell chokes everyone. Empty belts pile up high. Spent casings cover the floor. The enclosed pillbox feels tiny. Gunners frantically try to surrender. Hands go up. They face very angry men. These attackers just lost friends. The heavy fire destroyed platoons. They want pure, violent revenge. Surrender is a deadly lottery. Machine gun crews remain priority targets. Infantrymen hate them very deeply. Hate runs deep. The 1929 Geneva Convention applies. Article 2 demands taking prisoners. It requires fair human treatment, but close combat dictates different rules. Adrenaline quickly overrides international law. Professionalism vanishes under extreme stress. Uncertainty fills the tight space. Will the gunners survive today? The rifle barrel points forward. Fingers rest lightly upon triggers. Eyes meet inside the bunker. Silence replaces the chaotic gunfire. Will they die? Who knows? A split-second choice by an attacking soldier dictates the ultimate fate of the enemy prisoner standing right before him. What happened to the men who survived the bunkers? For decades, Heinrich Severloh kept quiet about his time defending the 8-kilometer stretch of Omaha Beach. The soldiers who made it through the assault and the camps eventually went back home to their towns. Severloh returned to a peaceful farm in Germany, living a seemingly normal life while dealing with daily chores. But the sheer scale of the 1944 invasion stayed with him. Decades later, he finally sat down at a table to share a meal with David Silva, an American veteran who landed on that exact same beach. Severloh had actually wounded him during the chaotic morning hours of the landing. Two old men shared a quiet conversation about a day they barely managed to survive. Most other veterans rarely spoke about their weapons with anyone outside their immediate families. But the rest of the world certainly remembered the machine gun. The acoustic signature of the MG42 deeply penetrated global pop culture. Movie theaters played the specific, high-pitched buzzsaw sound of the weapon, blurring the intense firing rate into a single mechanical roar through the speakers. Hollywood films like The Longest Day in 1962 and Saving Private Ryan in 1998 cemented that distinct noise in the public mind. The movie industry turned a piece of wartime hardware into a cultural symbol. Today, the thick concrete bunkers of Normandy simply stand empty on the French coast.